Right. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Nice to be meeting you all here after a nice lunch with a little samba. Thank you, Trevor, for setting up, Trevor and ITS for setting up such a great and thought-provoking event. And the idea here is I want to talk to you about what's behind blockchain and DAOs. And I want to try and set up a level playing field. My name is Ronnie Paskin. I am a software engineer. I'm a researcher in blockchain. I've been researching that for a few years now. And I want to set up that level playing field so that everybody is pretty much aware of the concepts behind all this that make all of this possible, blockchain and DAOs. All right, a little bit about us. I'm from PUC Rio. PUC Rio is one of the 10 top Latin American universities. I'm very much involved with some of our innovation programs that are in there. I'm going to leave at the end also some of our contact information. And by the way, we have applications open to students, university students from any course, any university in Brazil, or maybe even outside of Brazil. And so I'm going to leave that later. We also have Ecoa, which is a really cool platform with a lot of videos on blockchain and other subjects. So check it out if you can. And to start, you know, it all started a little bit before that, but the big boom came in 2008 when Satoshi Nakamoto, whom we don't know who it is, right, till this day. Nobody knows if it's one person, multiple people, if it's an alias, we don't know. But he published that paper entitled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And the basic idea was to set up an electronic cash system that could allow people to send money or some sort of financial instrument between people without a financial institution, without a central authority over that process. And the main thing, and this is a very accessible paper, it's only about 9 pages, and you don't need to understand the math behind it to read it. It's really worth taking a look. And the main problem that it's trying to solve is to prevent double spending. So that if I say that I'm sending 1 Bitcoin to Trevor over here, I can't run over in the network electronically to somebody else and spend that same Bitcoin elsewhere, right? That wouldn't work. But how do I do that without having a financial institution that's a gatekeeper for all the transactions? So he says, what we need is an electronic payment system that's based on cryptographic proof instead of trust between people. So that 2 willing parties can do that without that trusted gatekeeper, right? And we're going to be talking about the concepts here in a bit. So we're really talking about trust, cooperation in a decentralized fashion. And when we're talking about these things, note that I haven't really talked about the technology yet. So I will be talking about technology, but I think the main concepts that we need to focus on are trust, cooperation, and decentralization. But let's go to the technology, and I always like to remind people that technology doesn't exist without people. Technology exists because and to serve people. So technology, I frame it as arts or crafts in service of humanity, or applied scientific knowledge to aid human life. So it's very, very important to remember that. And I remember hearing somebody today talk about something similar, which was good. So the first concept that we should talk about is peer-to-peer systems. And some of you, or maybe many of you, must have used something like a torrent to download a legal file, such as OpenOffice or a public domain book, for example. And the way that works is you take some bits, some parts of each file from different participants on the network, right? And even you yourself could be sending that part of the file that you have to somebody else. So everybody participates in the network and makes it all work without having a centralized system. The second part that's very important is the cryptographic keys. And mainly we're going to be talking about what's called an asymmetric key pair cryptography. And the way I like to explain that is the first thing is imagine you have a public key and a private key. How does that work? Imagine a mailbox, right? And in that mailbox, you have a main compartment that has all the mail that you're receiving. To access that compartment, you have one key that opens the little door to the main door to the mailbox, and you can take the mail out and read it. You're the only one that has that key. Of course, you can make copies of that key if you want, but that would mean that anyone could read your mail, right? So let's consider that a private key. Meanwhile, you have the top of that box, imagine a hinged door, and that door has another little lock on it with what's called a public key. And that key, you can send copies of that key to many, many people, right? And that way, anyone can go to that mailbox, open that hinged door, drop the mail in, and they can send you mail, but you're the only one that can read that mail. That's pretty much the concept of private and public keys, right? That being said, the other effect that has is another thing that can be done with that public and private key pair is I can send somebody my public key. I can send a message such as I'm sending 1 Bitcoin to Trevor and sign that message with my private key. If I do that, I get a signature. And if I send those 3 pieces of information, the signature, the message, and my public key to somebody, they can know for sure that I'm the only one that could have signed that message. There's a mathematical algorithm that can prove that only the holder of that private key can generate that signature. So that way, I can prove that I'm the one that sent the Bitcoin to Trevor. And if you ever heard of a blockchain wallet, essentially what you're saying is my blockchain wallet is my public key. So that public key, which is derived mathematically from my private key, holds the power to authenticate my transactions as coming from me. And the other interesting aspect is since, remember we said there's no gatekeeper, right? So I'm generating that key pair myself through a random number, essentially, by using some sort of random process, generating a random number, and it's mathematically basically impossible, or almost impossible, at least with current technology, for 2 people to generate the same key pair. Okay? The next thing that's really important to know is hashes. And if we think about torrents, maybe some of you have seen that. Usually files have a hash. And a hashing algorithm, if you look at that funnel over there, basically you're taking any amount of data, that data goes through that algorithm, that funnel, the hashing algorithm. There are several different hashing algorithms. And you end up with a number that's usually fixed size in number. And the cool thing about this is it's deterministic, so that if you have the same input data, you have the same output number. And if any little thing changes, like a little dot, a little comma, any space, the number that's the result from that hashing algorithm will be completely different. And what that means is I can check the integrity of that original data without looking through all the data to see what has changed. I just need to look at the final smaller, much smaller number. And usually it's such a change that we only look at the first 3 or 4 digits and the last 3 or 4 digits, and that's enough to know that something changed in that data. So that's how we verify integrity of a large set of data by looking at a much smaller hash number. We are also talking about a network that works in a distributed fashion, so that nodes in the network talk to each other. They don't necessarily talk to all other nodes, and there's also no central point in that network that's required to perform the operations. And finally, we get to the blockchain itself. So why is it called a blockchain? As we see here, it's usually more like a line, not a square like this, but a blockchain is called a blockchain because it has blocks of information, such as I'm sending 1 Bitcoin to Trevor, and lots of other information that anyone wants to store on the blockchain. That information is hashed through the hashing algorithm that we talked about before, so that the integrity of all the information that's kept there on that, what we call the distributed ledger, right? So a distributed ledger of information, or a DLT, or distributed ledger technology. So the information is kept there, and interestingly enough, all blockchains are DLTs, not all DLTs are blockchains, and some projects are DLTs and not exactly blockchains. Might be a little confusing, but why is it a chain? Why is it a blockchain? because we might have blocks of information, and they're chained to the previous block by including the hash of all the data in the previous block in the next block. So that way, what we get is something that if any information changes within that block, the hashing, the calculation would fail, right? So that everybody could tell right away without even knowing what's in that block, or looking through all the details, they could verify that something has changed and say, no, no, no. You can't spend that 1 Bitcoin sending it to Trevor, but here it says I'm spending that Bitcoin sending it to Phil, right? So that wouldn't be acceptable because the hashes would be different because of the different information. So, and we're working in a platform that everybody agreed on the consensus of how we get to the final information that's on the blockchain. So I'm going to run a little bit here. So we're talking about that cooperation, right? So the whole system only functions because of cooperation. And something really interesting that came about because of all this was the creation of the decentralized autonomous organizations that are based on some of the same principles. And these DAOs essentially are organizations in which multiple people are trying to achieve a goal, but they're autonomous and they're not subject to one central control, right? So it's an organization that operates on a blockchain, but how can it do that, right? It uses the final piece of technology that we're going to be talking about today, which are smart contracts. And smart contracts are basically just, they're not artificial intelligence. It's not something that advanced. They're just a set of promises or protocols in digital format. And they're executed automatically, so not exactly by themselves, but when somebody interacts with them. And it's essentially just computer code, okay? It's digital format, meaning it is computer code. So it's not something extraordinary. It's just computer code that runs on the blockchain. And so essentially, people in a DAO are talking to each other through those set of promises or protocols in that smart contract and trying to reach consensus. Interestingly enough, I'm going to leave a link here to a very cool article by Vitalik that created Ethereum, talking about DAOs, but it's important to note DAOs are not corporations, and decentralization matters. We can argue that it's not necessarily decentralized, but it does matter. I've even heard that if a DAO becomes a corporation, it ceases to be a DAO. I think he agrees with me. It's not a panacea, right? I don't think it's going to solve everything, but I think it's, like Trevor says, still in the early stages. We have a lot to experiment, a lot to learn. But mainly, we talk about this technology, but again, we're really talking about is building trust, is decentralizing, and really cooperating, which I think is what we're all about here today. So thank you very much. Hope that was. And here's some of my contact information.
Should I wait for my one slide to be put up? But I think I'll just... So I think the order of presentations is actually perfect because I will be talking more about this, like a social aspect about DAOs. My name is Morshed. I am a postdoctoral researcher on the Blockchain Gov ERC project at the European University Institute in Florence. So what I'll be speaking about today in my 10 minutes is about a case study that I've done recently about a very particular type of DAO. They describe themselves as a DAO, but they don't match identically to what was described right now, in the sense that they are very much what we would understand as a type of collective. And they are a software developers collective named DORG. I think the quickest way and to sort of introduce it is by using this rubric. Basically, a few years ago, in the late 80s, there was the work by the sociologists Rothschild and Witt about collectivist democratic organizations. And there they identified two ideal types of organization. One is the bureaucratic organization. Those of you familiar with Max Weber and this sort of idea of bureaucratic organizations will understand that this refers to the traditional hierarchical corporation, but goes beyond that as well. And then the other is the collectivist democratic organization, which includes many types of cooperatives, but in their view, it goes beyond it as well. So they talk about unregistered associations, unincorporated associations that also operate in this way. And so the purpose of me introducing DORG in this way is to be able to show quite quickly, how is it that they have features of both a bureaucratic organization as well as a collectivist democratic organization, leading us to think that they are somewhere in between as a sort of hybrid. So where do DAOs, or so-called cooperative DAOs, as some of them are referred to, where do they fit in? So the idea of DORG as this collective of pseudonymous, which is also related to one of the features of DAOs that he alluded to, is that by being able to organize globally, you're also able to, in a way, obscure your identity, not fully, but to an extent, and thus cooperate with each other on a global scale. The reason why this is interesting is not just because we are here as a group interested in scaling or are interested in cooperation, but because one of the fundamental issues that the experience of cooperatives and the literature on cooperatives shows us is that it is difficult to maintain democratic cooperation at scale. And one of the reasons why I found this case of DORG to be interesting is because they've been thinking through the process of how do we maintain democracy at scale? How do we deal with the fact that we don't necessarily know each other very well, but we want to cooperate and have a sort of democratic workplace? So just briefly, in terms of just description of DORG, they were the first blockchain-based limited liability company in the state of Vermont. They use this to be able to, enter into contracts and so on, but a lot of what they do is basically online. One of the ways that they are similar to a cooperative or a worker cooperative is that instead of having a capital contribution to join, you join by contribution of labor. And the voting power there, interestingly, is not tied to, wealth. It's not like your share, one vote. Instead, you earn it through reputation. And the reputation is earned by the income that you generate for DORG. And what is also interesting and something that I will talk about is that this reputation is inflationary. What this means is that if you are a founder of DORG, that does not mean you can rest on your laurels. You cannot just rest on your old reputation. If you do not continue to contribute, and if you, let's say, move on to other projects, over time, your voting power diminishes. And as a way, that's a complete opposite of the dual class share structure discussion we were having earlier, where you don't have this sort of sunset necessarily of your voting power. So coming to these features, what Rothschild and Witt found is that there are these 8 features of these organizations. The first is where does authority reside? Of course, the first one is that there is authority at the level of the individual versus that of the collective. In these distributed business entities, as I and the author Carla Reyes call them, in DORG, the authority is rested in the collective. No individual has authority to impose their will on another. This is very much a characteristic of DAOs as well, more broadly. Then rules are quite interesting. So they find in studying everything from schools that are run as collectives to even clinics run as collectives, that the collectivist democratic organization ideally has minimal, informal, often unwritten rules, while a bureaucratic organization is the opposite. While what we find with distributed business entities, partly by the nature of the entity, they're very fixed and formal about how they have to define it, because voting, for instance, is executed automatically because of the smart contract features they use as just described. In terms of social control, again, there is a difference between all of these 3 types of organization. while the social control in a bureaucratic organization involves standard sanctions, and in collective democratic organizations, there aren't sanctions in the same way. Distributed business entities fit somewhere in between because there is first like personal appeals that are made by members of DORG that we would want to be treated in a certain way, to going all the way to on-chain enforcement to exclude certain types of members. Again, turning to social relations, in the collectivist democratic organization, especially a very small scale worker cooperative studied by Rothschild and Witt, you had a very communitarian ethos, while in the bureaucratic organizations they compare it with, the relations were more impersonal. Here, again, with DORG, there's a strong emphasis on community, which is played out on Discord, but also offline, not just necessarily online. That also plays out when we see how recruitment happens. In the collectivist democratic organization, it's supposed to be more friendship-based and informal. Of course, as we know with cooperatives, many of them do gravitate towards being more bureaucratic over time, right? So this is, again, two ideals, not necessarily exactly the case with all cooperatives. And then, in contrast, the DORG has now a very rigorous vetting of someone's skills before they allow them to join the organization. The incentives to join DORG are more financial than social and ideological, and there is a degree of inequality that is permitted, whether that is in terms of voting power, because of this emphasis on reputation, but there is still a tendency towards encouraging a sort of egalitarian attitude towards distribution of financial rewards. And finally, in the bureaucratic organization, we have a division of labor, while both in DORG as well as in the ideal collectivist democratic organization, we have a minimal division of labor. So why am I saying all of this and explaining this particular example is because of a point that I would like you to take away from this talk, is that while corporate governance or cooperative governance was designed to deal with trust problems in the bureaucratic organization, or even in the case of collectivist democratic organizations, what I call corporate governance by design is being used by these organizations for addressing confidence problems. So what is this distinction between trust and confidence is the fact that if trust is based on taking a risk and the opportunity for being betrayed by someone else, confidence is the issue that you believe that a technology or a system is operating properly and is predictable, and that there is this viability of that particular system, that you do not have the possibility of being betrayed in the same way. Corporate governance by design basically tries to achieve this by using technology. Now, my point of saying that this is being done is to also be a bit critical of it, because what we are seeing is that organizations like DORG are trying to deal with the problem of scaling trust, the fact that you don't know everyone, there are people from all over the world. You need to create confidence by using something like reputation-based voting, that, oh, I know you contribute good work, and thus I give you more voting power, even if I don't know you personally. The problem with this is that you're trying to deal with all governance problems before they happen. And you anticipate and think that you can preempt all of these governance issues before they actually materialize. And you do not create enough mechanisms to be able to deal with disputes that might arise that you did not predict. So what we are seeing with the issue of DORG, and I want to end my presentation by talking about this particular example of reputation, is that with the reputation system, you have this basis of earning reputation based on the work you do and the income you're generating for DORG. And this term comes from the fact that reputation is this age-old way of building commercial relationships in trade networks, right? Where the basis for trust and capacity for state coercion was very weak. especially in a globe-spanning and pseudonymous commercial system, where you couldn't have one state being able to say, oh, I'm going to send the police to enforce a contract or a bailiff to break into your house. And so knowing the reputation of a counterparty was very important for providing, this certainty. Now, what is happening here is that we're seeing this playing out again, and what is being used is that in the absence of a court being able to enforce against a DAO, you are using the threat of diminished reputation as the way of ordering behavior and to make people act as good actors. And especially because there's the similar opportunity for, it's the similar problem of not being able to coerce someone. So my idea is that what corporate governance by design is trying to do is to preempt certain what are called agency costs from arising. And one particular agency cost that is mentionable is this issue between, let's say, new members and old members. So in the case study that I did, there was this issue of recruiting lots of new DORG members because they thought that, oh, we are growing, we have $5 million in on-chain revenue, we're getting lots of new projects, we want to recruit new members into our organization. But then there was a conflict where the old members said, well, we're not ready yet to take on all of these old members right now. And so how do you deal with this? Especially when they have this inflationary reputation system where if old members stop contributing, their voting power diminishes over time. And so their idea with this inflationary system is that it's only those who are now contributing, regardless of whether they're old or new, that are going to really be able to have a decisive say on this. Now, my main sort of takeaway that I would like to leave you with is that you cannot address everything by using these sorts of reputation mechanisms, or having voting or forum discussions, because you still need something like a neutral third-party enforcement mechanism to be able to weigh in on when there are conflicting values. When you have a conflict between old members and new members over what they see as being important for the future of the organization. And right now, a lot of organizations, including DORG, are a bit lacking when it comes to this. So, and finally, working for bounties as you do with DORG, even if you're earning a lot, and DORG is one of the ones which is earning millions of dollars for its members, and its members are, actually making an income and a living from this, it still does not substitute for a stable job and employment rights. And one of the things that I'm now working on, and I'd love to talk to more people about this afterwards, is that these service DAOs, which is what DORG is, are now being complemented by new organizations which provide invoicing, payroll, tax, and other sorts of unionization DAO efforts to be able to support the people who are working for DAOs. And so this is like a new ecosystem of work support organizations that are beginning to emerge. And it is very interesting to see whether we will see in the future strike fund DAOs and union DAOs, and so on, that have started to be mentioned. So with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you very much.
All right, how's everyone doing? Okay, put your hand up if you use the internet. Keep your hand up if you're happy with the state of the internet. Okay, not that many people. Okay, interesting. So I'm Jad. I'm really excited to be here. I am a fellow at the ICDE, and I'm the co-founder of a company called Kudos Labs. We build consumer apps and tools that center on open content and open interest graphs. And I have been immersed in the world of co-ops for the last year, approximately, thanks to Trevor, and I'm very excited to share back some of my learnings with everyone. So if you can go to the first slide. So kind of to give a little bit of context about sort of a movement that came before blockchains and Web3, which is the decentralized web movement. And that movement was born out of a similar context to the platform co-op movement or the cooperative movement, which was evading massive platforms, sharing peer-to-peer, and giving ordinary people control over their own data. And much like the early days of the web, when things were still very academic or government-driven at the early stages, a lot of Web3 has been co-opted by commercial interests. A lot of money from venture capitalists, sort of a lot of hype around speculative sort of use cases of the technology, and that sort of moved things in a direction where cooperative principles are no longer kind of embedded in a lot of the decentralized web movement that sort of predated Web3. So I've been exploring what are some ways in which cooperative principles might be embedded into some of the work that developers have been doing in this space. And one of the big things that sort of underlies this space is this concept of trustlessness, which I think is impossible because trust is a very human construct, and a lot of the space tends to ignore human needs that are behind the addresses that a lot of the technology is built on. And trust is earned. It can't necessarily be delegated entirely to technology. Another kind of big principle that cooperatives are amazing at and have a lot of precedent and context on is democratic decision making and governance, as Morsha talked about, and the limitations of how democratic decision making works when it scales, when you have a lot of people that are involved in this process, and the concept of federation, small communities and small groups that are able to govern and manage and sort of do things effectively. And then the last one that I wanted to point out is the concept of bylaws or constitutions that underlie and hold accountable a lot of cooperatives that not very many companies have when they first get started. And I think that's a really important thing that I want to take away and sort of share back with developers that are building. Two core questions or themes that I've been really interested in is this idea of how we construct our identities online. And that's a very big part of how we exist on the internet. We consume and create continuously, and the way we form our identity is based on the kind of things that we leave behind on all the platforms that you occupy. If you walk into someone's bedroom, you get a sense for who they are based on what's on their shelf. The things that they've collected, perhaps the things they've created, the things they've been given, the things that they own. And right now that's sort of distributed across the web in small silos. And so I've been really interested in how might this sort of come together where we're able to kind of a user is able to reclaim the content that they put out, the interaction that they have in all these platforms, and sort of own themselves on the internet. Sort of that's been a very big question that I've been interested in exploring, and I think is really important to the future of the web. And the second is this concept of community, platform, and protocols that sort of underlie a lot of the social web and sort of consumer internet that we know today. And what's been really confusing, I think, to a lot of developers is the sequencing. Do I start by building a community and then launch an app and then trend down to a protocol? Or do I start with a protocol like Ethereum or Bitcoin and incentivize developers to build products and applications on top of it? And then sort of, perhaps that's where the community comes. Do I start by building an app and build that on top of a protocol and gather a community and sort of trend to exiting to community at some point? I don't think there's been a lot of thinking and work that's gone into why and how we kind of go through that sequencing and that kind of really important decision making throughout. And this is important because in order for us to have an internet where we own the data that we create, we own the data around our interactions, we need open protocols that sort of applications are built on top of so that we can enter a new application, take with us our interest and taste, and provision that in with our own consent. And so that's sort of what I've been really interested in and exploring with the Media Graph, which is a consortium that we initiated at Kudos Labs, is bringing together developer groups that have been working in silos right now, trying to come up with technology that allows for a future where we have open content and open interest graphs. And so I hope that I can come back next year and report more on what I'm continuing to learn. And I hope that we are able to sort of come together and work cooperatively as various developer groups, various organizations that are interested in a future where we own the data that we produce and the data that right now is hosted and extracted from us by closed platforms. And so thank you for listening, and pass it on to Philemon.
Well, thank you for being here. It's not easy to talk after these great presentations, but let's try to bring some new elements, although a lot has already been said. So waiting for the slideshow. I'll be talking about how DAOs and cooperatives that we've been talking about also link with another concept that we've been mentioning or talking about, but haven't really had a presentation yet about, is the commons. So the commons, what are they? I adopt a definition of the commons that is three-pronged. As you can see, you have the resource, but you also have a community and a set of rules. And I think it's very important that we have this triad and don't consider that we're only talking about a resource. For instance, for cooperatives, you can have different companies providing the same service or the same business, but the way that people organize and decide of the set of rules to govern their interactions will completely change whether it's a top-down company or if it's a cooperative. It's the same for a shared resource, which can be a natural one, such as a fishery or forest. I'll come back to that later. Or it can also be knowledge or digital commons. So the most famous one is Wikipedia, but blockchains and DAOs can also be considered as digital commons. So when studying and focusing on the commons, we need to focus on the community and the set of rules just as much as characterizing the resource. This is really close to what has been already said. So we need to focus on trust, cooperation, what brings people together, rather than on what has brought them together, the resource or the set of rules or the protocol of the blockchain. The commons, I think, are very important to take into consideration, especially at a time where we are facing social and environmental crises that are caused in great part by the extractive capitalism that focuses more on making profit rather than managing sustainably the resources. And I'm very happy to be here in Brazil today because the concept of the commons owes much to the nature that is incredible here. And there are many examples of commons throughout the country. There are protected areas where local communities have managed to deal with, to sustainably manage the forest and the fauna, the flora for hundreds of years. There are also fishing commons, mining commons, knowledge commons such as medicinal plants that is also being stolen by international companies and all these things. And the approach of the commons that links the resource with the community and the set of rules also goes beyond the dichotomy between man and nature. And this also is something that is largely influenced by indigenous Brazilian communities. So it's really significant it means a lot for me to be here today. This study of the commons owes much to Elinor Ostrom, who, while studying the communities and the set of rules they set up, identified 8 design principles that are summarized here. You don't need to read everything, but basically what matters is that she identified these 8 design principles. They are by no means mandatory. You can have sustainable and efficient commons, but it's just a good guideline of what to look at. And if you look, you have the first one, which is the community boundaries, so that relates to the community. Then you have the rules, number 2. Then you have collective, so you're really talking about cooperation and trust. And almost none of them talk about the resource itself. So it's all about studying how people agree and what they do if there's a conflict that arises. For instance, if you look at the design principle 5 on the top right-hand side, you have sanctions that need to be taken because we know that cooperating sometimes lead to disputes. and we need to address that in the best way as we can. Morshed mentioned that in DAOs and DAOs, you're trying to address the issues before they arise. And I think it's also something that has to be done in the commons, but it's much easier in traditional natural commons because you have trust and you have close-knit communities. And one of the issue and the questions that I've been working on is what happens when you scale up and you change the size of the community or the characteristics of this community. It becomes more heterogeneous. And the question is, what can we learn from traditional commons? So this has actually led to two-way research questions, where on the right-hand side, you have the commons and everything that we've known as has been studied for over 40 years. And on the left-hand side, you have blockchains and DAOs, which is much more recent, but have also managed to develop new institutional settings for cooperation that have been presented by René. So the two-way research questions is how can we use blockchain and DAOs to create new commons in situations where traditional governance has not succeeded? But the second question, which is closer to the subject of this panel, is how can we use learnings from the commons to improve the governance problems that arise in blockchains and DAOs? This research question has been extended to incorporate platform cooperatives thanks to the ICDE and the great research programs that they're conducting. And the lessons are now not only from commons, but also from co-ops. And it's really interesting because the links between co-ops and commons are numerous, as I will, as the next slide will exemplify. For instance, Trevor mentioned in his talk yesterday the 7 Rochdale principles. And if we look at the 7 Rochdale principles on the right-hand side and compare them with the Ostrom design principle, we can see that there's a lot in commons. So there's a mistake on this slide. If you look at the rose line, it shouldn't read tokenization, but codification of trust. Basically, the color of the lines are blockchain affordances. So it's what is enabled, new forms of cooperation enabled by blockchains and DAOs. This was, they were identified by Rosas et al. In a paper in 2021. And they only applied it to the 8 design principles. What I show in my work, in my research, is that they can also be extended to the 7 Rochdale principles, but as we can see, there are still two design Rochdale principles that aren't really met by any of these affordances, and that have no equivalence in the commons governance. So my future research will be to focus more on these design principles, on these cooperative principles, and see what are the specificities. One important aspect is that cooperatives are business first, as we've said several times. They are not necessarily profit-oriented, but they're still trying to, you're making a living out of the cooperatives. For the commons, the first focus is to sustainably manage the resource. So the two focuses are not the same. If, when studying commons, you also have to study how the costs and benefits are associated with the exploitation of the resource must be shared by the community. And I think that's where cooperatives come in. If you look at cooperatives, it's an amazing way of sharing costs and benefits, and that could be related to the study of the commons in a way that's already been experienced, but I think linking that with DAOs is a very promising way. This is just the groundwork of my research. There's much more. But I wanted to leave you with these ideas. But there are still points that are open that I'm working on. But I hope it also invites you to study that, or we can discuss it. First, how does this translate in practice? My research has been extremely theoretical, and one of the issues that we are facing when studying blockchains and commons is that we don't find many examples that work well in practice. And a commons only exists when working in practice, otherwise it becomes something else. I've mentioned the question of the Rochdale principles that have no equivalence and the question of for-profit DAOs. I know there are a few examples of projects trying to link that and that I'm also working on. Yesterday, Trevor mentioned in his talk a cooperative in Mexico called Pescadata. So Morshed is also working on it. They're creating data, and the fishermen who are creating this data are also owning the data, so it also closely relates to the data cooperative talks that we've had this morning. We're studying whether moving part of their activities onto a DAO would change and improve their management of the data and what they can do with it. And finally, and it's not written, but I think a very important point is that that's also been tackled several times since the beginning of the conference, is how cooperatives access to funding. And it's probably not for the best, but today there's a lot of money in Web3. And most of this money is not necessarily used for the best purpose. So channeling some of this money to cooperatives could be very useful, and moving some cooperatives to the DAOs just in order to access to funding would be, I think, also almost a valid reason to do it. So there are many questions. I've raised more questions than I've given an answer, but I think that's just what research is. I'm looking forward to discussing all of these issues with the other panelists and everyone in the room. And, also, I would like to thank the interpreters who've done an amazing job so far. Looking forward to the remainder of the discussion. Thank you very much.